The frost had barely settled over the burial mound of Chief Grokk Ironfang when his 31 years of rule were carved up on a war table beneath a gray, ash-colored sky. The reading of the inheritance was swift. Brutal, final, Borka Ironfang, the eldest son, took everything that mattered. The stonehold was his, the wolf pens, the grain vaults, the iron mines, and every fertile acre of the clan's territory belonged to him now. He sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed, already speaking as though the matter had been settled since the day he was born. Across from him sat Vrenna, Grokk's youngest, born to a mother no one in the hold spoke of, raised on scraps of attention and the label weak blood since she was old enough to understand the words. Beside her sat her little brother Grokk, 8 winters old, his small clawed hand gripping the edge of her sleeve. Pressed against Grokk's leg was Skarn, a gaunt gray direwolf pup with one torn ear, the only creature in the hold who had ever looked at Vrenna without contempt. When the reading finished, Vrenna's entire inheritance amounted to a limping war mount too old for the front lines, a cracked battle cart with one wheel held on by rope, a stretch of frozen, rock-choked ridge north of the Bonefall Pass, and exactly 15 copper rings. Borka slid the coins across the table with 2 fingers, like he didn't want to touch them longer than necessary. A thin, mocking smile crossed his tusks. "Charity," he said, "for blood that was never going to amount to anything." Grokk looked up at his sister. "Is Borka taking father's hold too?" Vrenna didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence in the room had already answered for her. She didn't argue. She didn't slam her fists on the table or demand fairness, though every warrior in that hall half expected her to. Because that was the story they'd already written about her. The angry orphan. The wild one. The weak blood with a temper. Instead, she swept the 15 copper rings off the table and into a pouch at her belt, picked up her father's old war ledger from where it sat forgotten on the bench, and stood. She didn't look at Borka. Her eyes went past the warm hearth fires, past the banners of the Ironfang Clan still hanging from the rafters, and out through the narrow window toward the northern horizon, where the wind was already screaming across the Bonefall Pass, and winter was no more than 2 moons away. 15 copper rings, a frozen ridge, a little brother, a wolf pup with a torn ear. That was what remained of 31 years. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, Vrenna led her small family out of the only hold they had ever known. If you've ever been told you didn't deserve a seat at the table, stick around. This one's for you. And before we go further north into the cold, drop a like and subscribe, because you're going to want to be here when the storm finally hits. The land waiting beyond the Bonefall Pass looked like it could barely sustain a colony of frost rats, let alone 2 orcs and a wolf pup. Cracked black stone stretched in every direction. Patches of thorny gray scrub clung to the slopes where nothing else would grow. Even the wind seemed reluctant to linger. It came in hard, fast gusts, then vanished, as if it had better places to be. The old war mount strained against the cart's broken wheel as it crawled over the frozen ground. Every step looked like a small victory. From the crest of a low ridge, Vrenna could still see the Ironfang hold in the distance. Smoke curled from its chimneys. Banners snapped in the wind above intact stone walls. The wolf pens were full. The grain vaults were sealed and secure. Everything Grokk Ironfang had spent 31 years building now belonged to a son who had never lifted a single stone of it. Vrenna climbed down from the cart and walked a slow circle around her new territory. Her eyes moved from the cracked black stone beneath her boots to the horizon, and back again. The cart's axle groaned. One of the side panels had split clean through. The canvas covering had 3 tiers wide enough to let snow pour straight through. 15 copper rings sat in the pouch at her belt. Grokk looked out across the empty rock. "Are we going back?" Vrenna followed his gaze toward the distant hold, where the smoke was still rising warm and lazy into the sky. Then she looked down at the frozen stone beneath her feet. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. The wind moved across the ridge. Skarn sat down in the dirt and waited, the way wolves wait, without expectation, without judgment, just presence. "No," Vrenna said finally, quiet but certain. "We build here. This is ours now. Nobody can take this from us." The first problem revealed itself before Vrenna drove a single stake into the ground. By midday, she stood inside Hrothgar's forge shop in the small trading settlement 2 days' walk from the ridge, watching the old blacksmith merchant tally figures with a piece of chalk on slate. Timber. Iron nails. Hide for the roof. A stovepipe, if she wanted heat that wouldn't kill her in her sleep. The numbers kept climbing. A hut small enough for 2 orcs, a wolf, and a war mount would cost well over 130 copper rings. Vrenna had 15. Hrothgar looked up from the slate, then back down at the 15 copper coins sitting on the counter. He didn't say anything cruel. He didn't need to. He simply slid the slate back toward himself and wiped the numbers away with his sleeve. Neither of them needed to say much. The arithmetic had already spoken. Back at the ridge, another plan failed just as fast. A shallow vein of darker soil suggested moisture beneath the cracked stone, maybe enough to dig a proper pit shelter, the kind older orcs used to carve into hillsides for winter. Vrenna spent most of a day clawing into the ground with a broken shovel and her bare hands. Gravel and frozen dirt mixed together. The hole grew deeper. Then one wall collapsed inward and filled half the pit she'd spent the day digging. The next attempt involved stone and mud bricks, the kind used to seal gaps in old clan walls. A patch of damp earth near the base of the ridge seemed promising. The first brick held its shape. The second crumbled the moment she tried to lift it. It was clear the dry, frozen soil had nothing left to bind it together. Fuel offered little comfort either. Grokk gathered brittle sticks no thicker than his fingers. Skarn, proud of himself in the particular way only a wolf pup can be, dragged back a twisted root nearly as long as his own body and dropped it at Vrenna's feet, like an offering. Nobody else had much reason to feel proud of anything that day. Vrenna lifted the best stone brick she'd managed to shape and turned it over in her hands. A crack ran through the middle. Then another. The entire thing crumbled and fell apart at her boots, scattering across the frozen ground. Grokk watched quietly from a few feet away. For several long seconds, only the wind moved across the empty ridge. A few days later, another visitor arrived. Grombark, an old builder orc who had raised stone halls and timber huts across 3 clan territories, reined in his mount beside the broken cart and spent several minutes studying the property without saying a word. His eyes moved from the cracked axle to the limping war mount, then to Grokk, then to Skarn. Finally, he looked at the empty stretch of ground where a shelter should have been standing. Grombark was not the kind of orc who laughed before measuring a problem. "A proper hut needs real walls," he said at last, his voice gravel rough. Timber frame. Hide ceiling. A roof with enough pitch to shed snow before it builds up and crushes you. Tight joints. Packed seams. Anything less, and a bonefall winter will find every gap you leave. Vrenna listened. "A frame about 14 by 18 would do the job," Grombark continued, "if it's built right." The plan sounded reasonable. The cost did not. When Vrenna told him how much she actually had, Grombark pulled off his iron skullcap and rubbed the back of his neck. There was no easy answer to give. "Sell the land," he said finally. "Borka will buy it eventually. Work through the winter in the settlement, start fresh come spring." The suggestion hung in the cold air between them. Skarn settled beside Grokk and pressed his body against the boy's side, blocking part of the wind. Grombark noticed. His gaze lingered on Grokk for a long moment. "A child doesn't care about pride when the cold gets in," he said. The words landed harder than any insult could have. After a moment, he added something worse. "You might be right in your heart, Vrenna Ironfang, and still lose your brother by morning." Nothing in Vrenna's face changed. But long after Grumbark rode off toward the settlement, those words stayed with her, circling like crows over the ridge. The next trip took Vrenna back to the place that had once been her home. Pale sunlight covered the fields. Wolves moved through the pens near the iron well. War carts stood lined up beside the great hall. From a distance, the hold looked exactly as it had a month ago. Only the ownership had changed. Vrenna crossed the yard and stopped near the grain vaults, where stacks of dried straw bales sat against the outer wall, leftover bedding from the wolf pens, most of it damp and half-rotted from a recent thaw. "I'd like to buy some straw," she said. "Or hay. Whatever you're not using." Borka glanced at the 15 copper rings still sitting in the pouch at her belt and laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh that carried across the yard. "The straw belongs to me." He swept a clawed hand across the property. "The wolves belong to me. The iron belongs to me. Everything you're standing on and everything you're looking at belongs to me, little sister." A few hired warriors repairing a section of fence nearby slowed their work. Hammers paused mid-swing. Nobody interrupted. "If you're planning on building one of those little dreams again," Borka went on, voice dripping with amusement, "you should spend less time staring at the wind like it owes you something." A few of the warriors looked away, suddenly very interested in their own boots. Borka stepped closer. Close enough that Vrenna could smell the ale on his breath even at midday. "Father spent 30 winters cleaning up after the messes of weak blood like you," he said. He was too soft. The words hung in the cold air. Then Borka turned, walked to a pile of weathered straw bales stacked behind the wolf pens, most of them soaked through, falling apart at the edges. Useless for anything but rot, and kicked the pile apart with one boot. "There," he said, pointing at the scattered, ruined bales. "That's your portion. Suits a beggar better than good feed anyway." Near the cart, Grokk watched everything unfold, his small hands curled into fists at his sides. Skarn let out a low growl, the fur along his spine standing up, when Borka stepped closer to Vrenna. Vrenna never answered. She simply bent down and gathered the discarded straw. "Build with that if you still want to pretend you're a builder," Borka called after her, already turning away, already laughing again, and this time several of the warriors near the fence laughed with him. A chorus of it, rolling across the yard, the kind of laughter that's meant to follow you home. One bundle, then another, then another. By the time Vrenna had loaded the last of it into the cracked cart, the laughter had faded behind her. The straw weighed almost nothing. Yet when she set it down beside her father's old war ledger, it felt strangely, impossibly heavy with meaning. If this story is hitting different so far, if you've ever had family laugh at you for trying to build something out of nothing, make sure you're subscribed. This channel is for people who know exactly what that feels like. Now let's see what Vrenna does with a pile of garbage straw and 15 copper rings. Darkness settled over the ridge long before Vrenna thought about sleep. With no walls to shelter behind, she and Grokk spent the night huddled together inside the broken cart, Skarn pressed against them both for warmth. A small fire burned in a cracked iron bowl beside the cart, the last of their dry kindling. Vrenna's father's old ledger lay open across her knees. Page after page carried Grokk Ironfang's handwriting, notes on snowfall, ice storm patterns, frost depth, fuel consumption during the hardest winters the clan had survived. Decades of observations from a leader who had outlasted 3 brutal generations of bonefall winters. One line appeared again and again throughout the pages, underlined more heavily each time it repeated, "The wind steals what it can touch." Vrenna read it again. And again. Then she looked toward the pile of damaged straw she'd hauled back from the hold. The bales sat beside the cart, pale silver under the cold moonlight. Something about them refused to leave her mind. A memory surfaced, one from when she was younger than Grokk, before her mother died, before weak blood became the only thing anyone called her. Winter nights in the old hold's hay loft above the wolf pens. Snow outside, frost thick on the shutters. But deep inside the piled straw, burrowed in alongside the pups, the cold had always seemed impossibly far away. She walked over to the discarded bales and pulled a single stalk free. The stem snapped cleanly between her claws. Its center was hollow. She picked up another stalk. The same, and another. Tiny chambers. Tiny pockets of trapped air all the way through. Vrenna rolled the stalk between her fingers, turning it slowly. A nest of straw could keep a sleeping pup warmer than bare stone ever could. A loft packed thick with it could stay warm long after the fire burned down to embers. The thought moved slowly through her mind. Not excitement, not certainty. Something quieter than both. A possibility, taking shape in the dark. Across the cart, Skarn slept against Grokk's side, his breathing slow and steady, rising into the cold night air in small clouds. Grokk stirred beneath the worn blanket and noticed the firelight still burning low. "Are you thinking about walls?" he asked, half asleep. Vrenna never looked up from the hollow stalk in her hand. Her eyes stayed fixed on it, turning it slowly, watching the tiny chambers catch the firelight. "I'm thinking," she said quietly, "about what the cold can't steal." Morning arrived with no miracle waiting for Vrenna. The straw still sat in a pile beside the cart. The land was still barren rock. Winter hadn't moved any farther away during the night. And yet something had changed. After a meager breakfast of dried meat strips, Vrenna knelt on a flat patch of black stone and began scratching lines into the frost with a sharpened bone. Grokk watched from nearby, Skarn curled up beside him with his chin resting on the boy's knee. 14 paces by 18. Large enough for sleeping mats, a stove, a small table. Space for a growing pup. Space for a boy who deserved more than a cracked cart for a bedroom. Vrenna sketched thicker lines around the outside. "Walls?" Grokk asked, leaning over to look. She nodded. "Thick ones." The plan grew as she talked it through out loud. Half for Grokk, half for herself. Straw bales stacked flat instead of standing on end, so the hollow stalks ran sideways, trapping air in long horizontal channels. Joints staggered between layers so no seam lined up with the one above or below it. Split cedar pine stakes driven straight through multiple layers to lock everything together. Hide strips, old wolf hide, the kind too worn for armor but still tough as rope, binding the corners tight. And over the outside, a shell. Clay mixed with sand, chopped, dry grass, and wood ash, spread thick like armor plating, sealing the straw away from rain, snow, and anything with teeth. The sketch looked strange even to Vrenna, scratched into the frost with crude lines. Nothing about it resembled any hut she'd ever seen standing across the Bonefall territories. Grokk studied the rough drawing for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that actually mattered. "Will it stand?" Vrenna looked toward the cracked cart, then toward the crumbled stone bricks still scattered where she'd left them the day before. Finally, she glanced down at the 15 copper rings in the pouch at her belt. "I don't know," she said. The answer came without hesitation, without flinching. Grokk was quiet for a moment. "At least you're honest," he said finally, and something about the way he said it, so seriously, so much like an adult repeating a phrase he'd heard somewhere, made Vrenna's mouth twitch. She managed a faint smile, the first one in days. At least I'm honest, she agreed. Grokk grinned back at her, small and crooked, and for just a moment the cold ridge didn't feel quite so heavy. Then his grin faded slightly, and he asked, more seriously this time, "Does Skarn get to sleep inside too?" Vrenna looked over at the wolf pup, who immediately lifted his head and thumped his tail against the frozen ground like he understood every word and had been waiting for someone to ask. That earned the first real laugh Vrenna had managed in days, short, surprised, almost rusty from disuse. "He might be the first one to know if it's working," she said. "Cold finds wolves before it finds anyone else." Skarn lifted his head higher, ears perked, looking deeply satisfied with himself, as if he'd just been promoted to chief inspector of the entire project. "The wagon won't keep us alive," Vrenna went on, more to herself now. "The stone won't hold. Timber costs more than we'll ever have." Her eyes drifted back to the pile of discarded straw. "If that's nothing but garbage, it's still the only thing we have enough of." Silence followed. A breeze moved across the scrub grass, carrying the smell of frost and distant smoke from the settlement. Grokk looked at the straw, then at the sketch in the frost, then at his sister. "Show me where to start," he said. "If you're enjoying this so far, hit subscribe now, because the next part is where things get interesting. A lot of people are about to laugh at Vrenna again, and I promise you, it does not end the way they think it will." The work began the very next day. Vrenna stopped measuring possibilities and started gathering materials. Some of the straw came from the bales Borka had thrown aside, soaked through, but salvageable once dried near a small fire. More came from smaller settlements scattered along the ridge, where old bedding straw sat forgotten and rotting behind sheds. A few landholders let her haul it away in exchange for a half-day's labor, mending fences, clearing brush, hauling stone. Every bale mattered. So did every length of cedar pine she cut and split by hand, her claws and palms blistering raw within the first week. Grokk worked too. He collected dry scrub grass by the armful, piled it near the build site, and, without anyone asking him to, started sorting the straw bales by how dry they were, lining up the best ones closest to where Vrenna was working. Skarn contributed in his own way. More than once, the pup proudly dragged home pieces of old rope, scraps of leather, or sticks nobody remembered leaving anywhere, dropping them at Vrenna's feet with the unmistakable pride of a creature certain he was being enormously helpful. The strange project attracted attention fast. Word travels quickly across cold, empty territory where nothing else is happening. The Ironfang weak blood is building a hut out of straw. The reactions arrived just as fast as the news did. Some orcs laughed outright. Others just shook their heads and went back to whatever they were doing. One rancher near the settlement claimed the walls would become winter feed for his goats before the first real snow even fell. Someone else suggested the first hard north wind would scatter the entire structure across the territory like ash. Borka seemed particularly pleased by the whole thing. "Beggar's hut," he called it, the first time someone mentioned it to him, and the name spread through the settlement within days. By the end of the week, traders and warriors alike were using it openly, sometimes even within earshot of Vrenna herself. Hrothgar rented her a few torn pieces of treated hide for roofing and added the charge quietly to a running tally on his slate. He never mocked the project to her face, but his expression carried the same flat, patient confidence of a creditor watching a bad debt grow worse by the week. Day after day, the walls rose. One layer of bales, then another, straw stacked flat, joints staggered, cedar stakes driven deep through each layer to lock it all together. It was slow work, and it was lonely work for long stretches of the day, with only Grokk's running commentary and Skarn's occasional unhelpful assistance to break the silence. Vrenna's hands cracked and bled in the cold mornings before the sun had any real warmth to offer. More than once she sat back on her heels at the end of a long day, staring at a wall that had grown maybe a single bale's height since dawn, and did the math in her head. How many more layers? How many more weeks? How much daylight was left before the first real snow? The numbers were never encouraging. She kept working anyway. Grokk, for his part, had appointed himself in charge of what he called the straw count, keeping track of how many bales they had left, how many they'd still need, and announcing the totals each evening with the gravity of someone delivering critical battlefield intelligence. Most evenings the numbers weren't great. A few evenings they were genuinely bad. Vrenna listened to all of it without flinching, then went back to work the next morning regardless. Skarn, meanwhile, had developed a habit of testing each new section of wall the moment it went up, leaning his full weight against it, scratching at the base, occasionally attempting to dig underneath it for reasons known only to him. Vrenna let him. If a half-grown wolf pup could find a weakness, so could a bonefall winter, and she'd rather know about it now. A few weeks in, Grombark rode out to see the progress for himself. Without asking permission, he dismounted, walked straight up to the unfinished wall, placed both broad hands flat against it, and pushed. The straw didn't shift. His brow furrowed. He pushed again, harder this time, leaning his full weight into it. The wall stayed exactly where it was. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Grokk stood off to the side, holding his breath without realizing it. Skarn watched the old builder with his head tilted. Finally, Grombark stepped back and brushed dust from his palms. That was the closest thing to approval Vrenna had received from anyone since she'd started. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite approval. Standing in the autumn sun, Grombark said, looking toward the northern horizon, where the sky had already started taking on the flat gray color that meant business is not the same as standing in the dead of winter. Then he mounted his wolf and rode off without another word. For a while, the hut seemed to justify Vrenna's confidence. The walls kept rising. The straw stayed dry under makeshift hide covers. The structure looked sturdier with every passing week. Then, autumn reminded her that an idea could survive in theory and still fail the moment it met reality. A cold rain swept across the ridge late one afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just a steady, grinding downpour that lasted half a day and soaked everything within reach. The real damage showed up the next morning. Vrenna stepped outside and immediately noticed thin cracks spreading across a wide section of the dried clay plaster on the north-facing wall. Some were no wider than a claw tip. Others ran several inches across the surface, branching like frost patterns on a window. Near the northern corner, the clay had pulled away from the straw entirely, leaving a gap wide enough to see straight through to the bales beneath. That was bad. The next thing was worse. A dark stain of moisture ran along the lower edge of the wall, right where the rainwater had pooled against the foundation overnight. Vrenna crouched beside it, running her claws along the damp clay. Water had been sitting exactly where it should never have been allowed to sit. A sharp bark cut through her thoughts. Skarn stood near the north side of the hut, scratching furiously at the base of the wall, then barking again, louder. Vrenna pulled back a loose section of clay near where Skarn was digging. Tiny bite marks ran through several exposed strands of straw. Frost mice. Dozens of small, fresh tunnels burrowed into the damp straw at the base of the wall. The problem suddenly looked much bigger than a few cracks. If moisture kept getting into the walls, the straw would rot from the inside out. If frost mice kept tunneling in, the hut could become a nest instead of a shelter, riddled with holes long before the first real blizzard ever arrived. Grombark's warning echoed louder than it ever had before. Vrenna didn't spend the day defending her design. She spent it changing it. A shallow trench appeared around the entire base of the hut by sundown, dug deep enough to carry rainwater away from the walls instead of letting it pool against them. Flat stones gathered from along the ridge formed a low protective skirt around the foundation, lifting the straw bales just slightly off the damp ground and giving the frost mice nothing soft to chew through before hitting solid rock. The plaster mixture changed too. More sand. More wood ash. Extra chopped scrub grass worked through the clay to strengthen how it bonded to the straw beneath. Hide strips sealed every gap near the base of the walls, pulled tight and pinned with cedar pegs. While Vrenna worked outside in the cold, Grokk arranged a trade with Norka, Grumbark's mate, a stout, sharp-eyed orc who ran a small leatherworking stall in the settlement. A repaired winter cloak for Norka's young granddaughter earned them a sack of fine wood ash and several lengths of old hide strips. No charity, just an exchange. That evening, Grokk set the sack down beside Vrenna without a word, looking pleased with himself in exactly the way Skarn usually did. Norka wouldn't take thanks for it, he said. She said a good seam is worth more than pity. Vrenna looked at the sack of ash, then at the wall, then back down at her work. The hut was no longer just an idea scratched into frost. It was becoming a lesson, and lessons rarely arrive without a price attached. The repairs solved one problem. They did nothing for another. Building materials still cost copper. Fuel still cost copper. Even dried meat and salt demanded coin Vrenna no longer had. A few days later, she made the long walk into the settlement and stopped outside Hrothgar's forge shop. The purchase itself was modest. A handful of iron nails, a sack of salted meat strips, an old stovepipe with enough rust on it to suggest at least 2 previous owners who'd given up on it. Hrothgar tallied the items and opened his account ledger. The debt wasn't large. Somehow, that almost made it worse. Small debts had a habit of growing quietly, the way frost spreads across a window pane, barely noticeable until suddenly the whole thing is covered. The old blacksmith ran one claw down the ledger page. Then he looked up. Borka made an offer, he said. Vrenna already knew where this was going. 40 copper rings for your land, Hrothgar said. Enough to clear your account here. Enough to rent a room through the winter. Enough to keep your brother fed and warm until the thaw. He folded his hands. You could work for Borka. Start over come spring. There was no cruelty in his voice, only arithmetic, plain and flat. To him, the decision seemed obvious. A territory could be reclaimed. A bad winter, survived with nothing, was a much less certain bet. Vrenna listened to all of it. Then she shook her head. No. Hrothgar sighed and added another line to his ledger, the chalk scratching softly across the slate. A few warriors standing near the forge fire exchanged knowing looks, the kind that said we'll see how she feels about that in a few months. Before Vrenna reached the door, Hrothgar spoke again, not unkindly. Midwinter changes a person's mind. Outside, the cold wind carried grit and ash across the settlement street. Vrenna tucked the old stovepipe under one arm and started toward where she'd left her war mount. A voice drifted from somewhere behind her, one of the warriors near the fire, not bothering to lower his voice. That pipe'll heat the sky before it heats straw walls. Laughter followed, loud, easy, the kind of laughter that costs the people making it absolutely nothing. Vrenna kept walking. The stovepipe rattled softly against her side as she swung up onto her mount and turned north, back toward the ridge, back toward the hut that everyone in the settlement was already certain would fail. Don't forget to like this video if you're rooting for Vrenna right now, because honestly, so am I. And if you've ever had people bet against you the way this entire settlement is betting against her, that like button is basically a middle finger to all of them. Let's keep going. October arrived before Vrenna fully realized how much the ridge had changed. What had begun as scratched lines in the frost now stood above the rock as a real structure. The walls had reached their full height. Thick cedar pine poles stretched across the top to support the roof. Worn pieces of treated hide stretched over the frame, and a thin cap of packed sod helped hold everything down against the wind. The revised plaster mixture had hardened across the entire exterior. The cracks that had worried Vrenna so badly hadn't returned, even after 2 more rounds of cold rain. Inside, Grokk had transformed the rough shelter into something that felt less like a structure and more like a home. A worn hide curtain separated the sleeping area. A small table, salvaged from the broken cart's side panel, stood against one wall. Grokk claimed a corner for himself, arranging his few belongings with the kind of careful pride only a child can manage. Skarn chose a spot near the door, where drafts were most likely to sneak in, and settled there like a self-appointed guard. Vrenna added one final piece. An old rune marked Weatherstone, the kind clan elders once used to predict storms, salvaged from her father's belongings. She hung beside the entrance, where she could check it morning and night. From then on, Grokk Ironfang's old war ledger took on a new purpose entirely. Every morning and every evening, Vrenna recorded the same details: outside temperature, inside temperature, wind direction, fuel burned, condition of each wall. The empty pages at the back of the ledger slowly began to fill with her handwriting beneath her father's. On the first truly cold night, the temperature outside dropped hard. Vrenna checked the Weatherstone before sunrise. Inside the hut, the air had stayed remarkably warm, and there had been no fire burning at all overnight. There was no celebration. The difference wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. For the first time, the numbers suggested the walls were doing something more than simply standing upright. Vrenna carefully added the results to the page. Grokk glanced over her shoulder at the fresh entry, and a faint smile crossed his face. "Father would have liked that," he said quietly. Vrenna looked down at the careful rows of numbers, her handwriting now sitting just beneath her father's, on the same pages, in the same old book. His ledger was holding a new experiment now. One he never got to see. The first serious windstorm arrived just a few days later. It came down from the north with the confidence of something that had never lost a fight in its life. Grit and frozen dust lifted off the ridge. Scrub grass bent flat against the rock. The hide roof rattled hard against the cedar poles. Then Skarn sprang to his feet, ears pinned back, and barked once, sharp and urgent. Then again. Vrenna heard it a heartbeat later. A loose flap of hide had torn free near the roofline and was snapping against the frame, hard enough that another good gust would tear it open completely. She grabbed a coil of hide strips and stepped outside. Cold hit her immediately, a wall of it, the wind tearing at her cloak the second she cleared the doorway. Frozen grit stung against her face. The torn hide cracked overhead like a whip. Vrenna climbed onto the edge of the roof, fought the wind for nearly 20 minutes to secure the loose section, and packed fresh clay into a narrow gap near the gable before the light failed completely. By the time she dropped back down and pushed through the door, her hands were numb past feeling, her claws stiff and aching. Inside, Grokk had already moved to the far corner, away from the door, with Skarn pressed against him. The small stove burned a mix of dried scrub grass and packed dung, the only fuel that burned hot and slow enough to last. Vrenna checked the Weatherstone. Outside, the cold was vicious enough to crack exposed stone. Inside, the air remained warm enough that she could feel her fingers again within minutes of sitting near the stove. The difference surprised even her. Beyond the walls, the wind sounded furious, a constant grinding roar that seemed personally offended by the hut's existence. Inside, it faded into something closer to a distant murmur, like the wind was complaining from very far away. Vrenna sat with her back against the warm wall for a long while after the worst of the storm passed, letting the feeling slowly return to her fingers. Across the room, Grokk had fallen asleep sitting up, his head tipped against Skarn's flank, the wolf's chin resting protectively over the boy's shoulder. Neither of them stirred even when another gust rattled the roof overhead. Vrenna watched them both for a moment. Then she picked up the ledger. Beneath the previous entries, she added a few brief lines, her handwriting cramped from the cold. North wall held. Roof edge loosened, fixed before dark. Cold did not get in. Grokk watched her finish writing. "Did the wind get in?" he asked. Vrenna rested one hand flat against the nearest wall. The plaster felt cool beneath her palm. The air around them did not. "Not enough to matter," she said. Outside, the ridge kept fighting. Inside, for the first time, still air was beginning to win. Borka arrived on Wolfback 3 days later. His visit carried the same purpose as most of his recent appearances. He wanted to see the failure with his own eyes, up close, where he could enjoy it properly. The low-pitched roof earned a smirk the moment he rode up. The slightly uneven plaster along one wall drew another. By the time he reached the doorway, the old name had already returned, dripping with satisfaction. "Quite the beggar's hut," he said, swinging down off his wolf. Inside, however, something interrupted his amusement almost immediately. The air felt warm, not comfortable, not impressive by any stretch, just noticeably, undeniably warmer than the freezing ridge outside, and Borka noticed it the second he stepped through the doorway, his expression flickering for half a heartbeat before he caught himself. He refused to admit it. "A box of straw can fool a person for a few weeks," he said, looking around the small room with exaggerated disinterest. "That doesn't make it a hold." Vrenna offered no argument. The ledger sat open on the small table nearby, columns of numbers filling the newest pages. Temperatures, wind directions, fuel consumption, wall conditions, day after day. Borka flipped through several entries, his expression unreadable. "Numbers won't stop midwinter," he said finally, setting the ledger back down. Vrenna glanced toward the wall beside the stove. "Walls might," she said. The answer hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Grokk avoided his uncle's eyes entirely, staring hard at the floor. When Borka asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the boy missed the old hold, Grokk said nothing at all. Skarn stepped between them and let out a low, steady growl, the fur along his back standing up. Nobody commented on it. A few minutes later, Borka mounted his wolf and headed back toward the hold. Halfway down the slope, he looked back over his shoulder. And for the first time since any of this had started, he actually studied the hut instead of laughing at it. Winter continued its slow approach. One gray afternoon, York, the old clan shaman, keeper of rites and rituals for 3 generations of Ironfangs, arrived carrying a small pouch of dried berries for Grokk. He spoke gently, choosing his words with the kind of care that suggested he'd rehearsed them on the walk over. "Families," he explained, settling onto a low stone near the doorway, sometimes accept difficult arrangements. To avoid bitterness, lawsuits, lasting division between blood. Vrenna listened without interrupting. Then she asked a simple question. "Did you read the inheritance scroll, York?" For a moment, the old shaman said nothing at all. His eyes drifted toward the stove, toward the small, flickering flame inside it. That silence answered more than words ever could. He had read it. He understood exactly what had happened. The manipulation, the unequal split, all of it. The problem had never been ignorance. The problem was weight. Borka held the territory. Borka controlled trade credit through Hrothgar. Borka's warriors patrolled half the Bonefall region. Vrenna held a straw hut that hadn't yet faced a real winter, and a ledger full of numbers nobody outside this room had any reason to believe. The conversation drifted elsewhere after that. Small talk, news from the settlement, nothing that mattered. Grokk sat near the wall, eating dried berries one at a time, while Skarn slept curled against his side. Neither of them shivered. Neither of them seemed remotely aware of the quiet argument that had just taken place above their heads. A gust struck the north side of the hut. The walls absorbed it without complaint. York listened to the silence that followed. "I pray this holds," he said quietly. Vrenna looked up from a patch of fresh plaster she'd been smoothing near the doorway. "Prayers are welcome," she said. "So is plaster." A faint smile crossed York's face. Then it disappeared. Before he left, the old shaman paused beside Grokk Ironfang's ledger, resting one weathered hand on its cover for a long moment. The gesture looked almost accidental, until he pulled his hand back quickly, as though the old book held something far heavier than paper and ink. Outside, the wind continued across the ridge. Inside, another kind of silence remained behind long after he'd gone. If you've made it this far, you already know something big is coming. Smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, let's talk about January. Midwinter arrived with a warning rather than a verdict. One morning, Vrenna checked the weather stone before sunrise. The cold outside was savage, the kind that froze breath solid in the air and made exposed metal dangerous to touch. Inside, the hut had held warm and steady through the entire night. She recorded the numbers. Fuel used, 1 bowl of packed scrub dung and dried grass. North wall dry, south wall tight. The entry looked almost unbelievable, even written in her own hand. Across the rest of the territory, other orcs were feeding their stoves constantly, just to survive the nights. Drafts slipped through the gaps in aging timber walls. Wood piles shrank fast. Coal ran out faster. Inside the straw hut, the fuel stack remained noticeably larger than Vrenna had expected. Grokk noticed it before she did. He'd been quietly tracking how much they burned each night. The way kids sometimes track things, adults are too busy to notice. Life had changed in smaller ways, too. Grokk no longer asked about the old hold. One evening, while spreading his sleeping mat near the wall, he referred to the hut as our hold without thinking twice about it. Vrenna lowered her head and kept stirring the pot of stew without saying anything. But she heard the words. She never commented on them, but she heard them. Midwinter had proven something important. It had not proven enough. That night, Skarn left the warmth near the stove and walked over to stand beside the door. His ears swiveled north, pointed and rigid, and he listened for several long seconds, a low whine building in his throat. The hardest part of winter had not arrived yet. Whatever Skarn had been listening for in the freezing darkness was about to reveal itself, and it was bigger than anything any of them had prepared for. The day everyone in the Bonefall territory would remember arrived beneath a sky the color of old iron. Vrenna noticed the change before sunrise. The Weatherstone's runes had been darkening since midnight, slowly at first, then faster. The carved symbols glowing a deep, ominous red that hadn't been seen in years. By the time the weak winter sun cleared the horizon, the stone's warning had already silenced whatever optimism remained from the easier days of midwinter. Outside, the territory waited. At midday, it struck. A north wind slammed into the ridge with such force that loose snow never even had the chance to settle on the ground. It raced sideways instead of falling, white sheets of it tearing across the rock in horizontal blasts. The temperature began collapsing, falling, faster than the Weatherstone had ever recorded. The storm seemed determined to erase the line between earth and sky entirely. Inside the hut, Vrenna moved methodically, the way she'd practiced a dozen times in her head over the past few months. The hide gasket around the door got one final inspection. Fresh clay sealed a narrow gap near the gable that had opened slightly during the autumn. Fuel got shifted closer to the stove, within easy reach. The stovepipe got checked twice. Nothing happened quickly. Nothing happened carelessly. Across the room, Grokk sat wrapped in blankets while Skarn pressed against him, and the two of them watched Vrenna work without saying much. Skarn kept lifting his head toward the north wall every few minutes, ears swiveling, tracking something none of them could see. The hut absorbed the first impact. Then the second. Then the third. Wind hammered against the walls without pause, a relentless, grinding pressure that seemed to come from every direction at once. The roof groaned under the weight of snow and force. The hide covering tightened and released, like the whole structure was breathing. Snow hissed across the exterior in a constant rushing sound. Yet something important didn't happen. The walls never shuddered the way a timber frame might. Their sheer thickness spread the force of the wind across the entire shell of the structure instead of concentrating it against thin panels and joints. The pressure arrived. The pressure stayed. The pressure moved through, distributed, absorbed, dissipated. Inside, the air remained warm. Steady, Vrenna recorded each reading despite her fingers stiffening painfully from the cold seeping in around the door. Outside, the storm kept growing stronger. Inside, the measurements kept being recorded, hour after hour, in handwriting that grew shakier but never stopped. The Weatherstone's runes burned deeper red. The north wind intensified. The walls absorbed another hour. And another. The storm offered no explanations. No warnings beyond the ones it had already given. It simply kept increasing the weight of its judgment against the ridge, hour after hour after hour. By mid-afternoon, the light outside had taken on a strange, flat quality. Not quite dark, not quite anything Vrenna had a word for. The single window slit, packed with hide and sealed tight, let through only a faint gray glow, and even that seemed to flicker as snow built up against the outside of it. Grokk had stopped asking questions an hour or so earlier. He sat very still, wrapped in blankets, watching Vrenna move between the stove, the door, and the walls with the kind of focused attention that made him look much older than 8 winters. Skarn hadn't moved from his spot near the door in some time, but his ears never stopped working, swiveling toward every new sound the wind threw at the walls, cataloging each one, deciding whether it mattered. Most of them didn't. A few did, and each time, Vrenna was already moving toward whatever had made the sound before Skarn had even finished turning his head. A particularly violent gust slammed into the hut near sunset, hard enough to make the entire structure groan. Grokk looked up from his blanket. Is the hut going to blow away? For a moment, Vrenna said nothing. She wasn't listening to the wind. She was listening to the structure itself. The walls answered with silence. No, she said finally, resting her hand flat against the plaster beside her. It has weight now. Beyond the door, the blizzard kept coming. The real test had only just begun. Sometime after dark, the first knock came. The sound barely reached the hut at all. The wind swallowed most of it. The snow carried away the rest. Skarn heard it anyway. The wolf sprang to his feet and rushed toward the door, barking hard enough to cut clean through the roar of the storm outside. Vrenna pulled back the latch. A blast of frozen air swept inside, carrying needles of snow that stung against her face. Beyond the doorway stood Grumbark, Norka, and their young granddaughter, all three of them wrapped in cloaks stiff with ice. Snow caked their shoulders. Frost clung to Grumbark's brow ridges and the fur lining of Norka's hood. The old builder's timber hall was still standing. But standing was no longer the issue. Wind had been slipping through the frame walls for hours straight. The hearth burned constantly. The temperature inside kept falling anyway, no matter how much fuel they fed it. Vrenna stepped aside without a word. Nobody wasted time discussing pride. Grumbark and his family moved inside, and the door slammed shut against the storm behind them. An hour later, Skarn barked again. This time, the figure outside looked familiar. Borka Ironfang stood in the darkness, barely visible through the driving snow. Gone was the confident posture. Gone was the easy, mocking smile. Snow covered his shoulders in a thick layer. His lips had taken on a bluish tint from the cold. Behind him stood his mate and two children, all of them shaking, all of them barely able to stand upright against the wind. A storage roof at the hold had collapsed under the weight of drifting snow, burying part of the iron vault. Worse than that, the great hall itself had become impossible to keep warm. A bucket of water sitting near the hearth had frozen solid along its rim. Borka guided his family forward first. Then he stopped. One boot remained outside the threshold, hovering in the snow. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, he looked uncertain, as if he genuinely didn't know whether he belonged inside this hut after everything. Words tried to come. None of them made it very far. Vrenna didn't wait. She reached forward, grabbed the front of her brother's frost-stiff cloak, and pulled him inside. The door shut. The storm disappeared back into the darkness on the other side of it. Space became precious almost immediately. Fuel calculations changed on the spot. More bodies meant more warmth, but also greater demands on a stove that had been built to heat 2 orcs and a wolf, not 9. Wet cloaks got hung away from the walls to dry without dripping onto the floor or the bales beneath. The stove received constant, careful attention. The door opened only when absolutely necessary, and even then only for seconds at a time. Everyone sat close together, packed onto sleeping mats and folded blankets, sharing what warmth there was. Hours passed. The wind continued hammering the hut without mercy. Meanwhile, a different problem emerged. Grokk began coughing, not constantly, just enough that Vrenna noticed it, just enough to make her glance toward the fuel pile and then back toward her brother, doing quiet math in her head. The fuel pile looked smaller than it had that morning, noticeably smaller. Still, nobody suggested leaving. Nobody mentioned the nickname. Nobody spoke about the laughter back in the settlement, or the bets placed against this exact wall, or any of it. The same walls that had once been mocked as a beggar's hut were now the only thing standing between everyone in this room and a storm that had already proven it could kill, and the blizzard was far from finished. This is the part where everything either falls apart or proves Vrenna right. If you don't want to miss how this ends, hit subscribe right now, and let me know in the comments who you think deserves to be in that hut tonight, and who doesn't. I have a feeling some of you are going to have opinions. The blizzard finally loosened its grip during the 3rd morning. Sunlight returned first. Then came the silence. After nearly 3 days of constant wind, the absence of sound felt almost unnatural, heavy, strange, like the entire world was holding its breath. Vrenna opened the door and stepped outside. The world had disappeared beneath snow. Drifts reached the lower edge of the windows. Fence lines had vanished completely. Even familiar landmarks along the ridge looked unrecognizable, reshaped by 3 days of relentless wind. The Weatherstone delivered one final reading, colder than anything any of them had ever recorded. colder than anything in Grokk Ironfang's old ledger. Inside the hut, the air still measured warm. Steady, nobody would have called it comfortable. But comfort had never been the goal. Everyone was alive. That was enough. Grokk's cough had faded sometime during the night. Skarn stretched out beside the stove and yawned theatrically, as if the last 3 days had been little more than a minor inconvenience he'd graciously tolerated. One by one, the guests prepared to leave, bundling back into their dried cloaks and gathering their belongings. Before mounting his wolf, Grumbark stopped beside the wall. He placed one hand against the plaster and held it there for several long seconds. The old builder, who had once argued for timber frames and conventional walls, now studied the structure with a completely different expression on his face. "How much ash did you mix into the plaster?" he asked. It was the first technical question he'd ever asked her. Vrenna answered it. Then another question followed, and another, right behind it. Norka exchanged a glance with Vrenna. Neither of them said much. Neither needed to. Some lessons explain themselves once you've lived through the proof. Roads slowly reopened over the following days, packed down paths cut through the drifts by wolf sleds and determined feet. York eventually made his way out to the ridge. He found Borka standing outside the hut, staring at the walls, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. The old shaman said nothing. So did Borka. For a long moment, both of them simply looked at the structure that, according to everyone who had ever judged it, should not have worked. Should not have survived a single hard frost, let alone the worst storm in living memory. Eventually, Borka broke the silence. "Father would have known," he said quietly. Not an accusation. Not quite an apology either. Just a statement, spoken to the wall as much as to anyone standing near it. Vrenna stood near the doorway, arms crossed against the cold breeze moving across the snow. "He wrote some of it down," she said. That was all. No apology followed. No dramatic reconciliation. No tearful embrace between estranged siblings. No grand gesture of returned land or restored honor. Nature had already settled the argument on its own terms, 3 days and 3 nights ago, in a language that didn't require anyone's pride to translate it. But something had shifted, quietly, the way most real changes do. Before he left that morning, Borka paused beside his wolf, one hand resting on the saddle. He looked back at the hut one more time. At Grokk, sitting near the doorway with Skarn's head in his lap, both of them watching him with matching wary expressions. At Vrenna, standing exactly where she'd been standing the entire conversation, not moving toward him, not moving away. "The vault roof," Borka said finally, not quite looking at her. "The one that collapsed. I'll need extra hands to clear it before the next storm comes through." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it also wasn't an order, the way everything out of Borka's mouth had always been an order before. It was something else. Something that sounded, for the first time in either of their lives, almost like a question. Vrenna considered it for a long moment. "Grokk and I can spare a few days," she said finally. "After the trench here gets cleared first. This hut comes first." Borka's jaw tightened slightly, the old reflex, the one that wanted to argue, to remind her whose territory this technically still was, whose name carried weight across the Bonefall region. He swallowed it instead. "After the trench, then," he said, and swung up onto his wolf without another word. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't family, not in any way that would have meant something 6 months earlier. But it was the first time in either of their lives that Borka had asked his sister for anything at all, instead of simply taking it, or laughing at her for not having it to give. Grokk watched him ride off toward the hold, snow crunching under the wolf's paws. Did that just happen? He asked, looking up at Vrenna with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. It happened, Vrenna confirmed, just as surprised as he was. Don't get used to it. But she was already thinking about the trench and the vault roof, and what materials might be salvageable from a collapsed structure that nobody else would think to ask about. Spring arrived several weeks later, melting the drifts down into mud and exposing the cracked black stone underneath. The hut remained standing. So did the questions. Other orcs from across the territory began showing up, first one at a time, then in small groups, all asking about the same things. Drainage trenches, plaster mixtures, how to build storage sheds that wouldn't collapse under snow weight, storm shelters for livestock, storm shelters for people. Vrenna never treated any of it as a secret. She walked visitors around the gravel trench, the stone foundation skirt, the cedar stakes driven through staggered straw layers, the plaster recipe written in careful detail across the back pages of her father's old ledger. Most importantly, she explained the part that nobody else seemed to think about: the value of still air. Not thick walls for their own sake, but walls that trapped air and kept it from moving, kept it from carrying heat away the moment it formed. The old nickname survived longer than anyone expected. People still called it the beggar's hut, here and there, out of habit more than anything else. The difference was that nobody laughed when they said it anymore. A group of younger orc girls from the settlement, the ones who'd grown up hearing weak blood thrown around just as casually as Vrenna once had, started using a different name when they talked about her. Not Vrenna Ironfang. Not the weak blood, not the beggar, not any of the names that had followed her since she was younger than Grokk was now. Vrenna Stonewall. It started as a joke, the way most good names do. Then it just stuck, spread the way the old nickname had spread, except this time it traveled with something closer to respect riding alongside it. Vrenna never asked for it. She never corrected it either. One evening, after the hut had gone quiet and the last visitor of the day had finally headed back down toward the settlement, Vrenna sat near the stove and turned the pages of her father's old ledger one final time for the season. The final entry from the storm waited near the bottom of a page, written in her own cramped, frost-stiffened handwriting from that third terrible morning, the north wind. Held, her eyes rested on the words for a long moment. Then she closed the book. Not like someone celebrating a victory. There was no triumph in the gesture, no satisfaction aimed at anyone who doubted her, no imagined audience of settlement orcs watching her prove them all wrong. It was quieter than that. Steadier, Grokk had already fallen asleep nearby, curled against Skarn's side near the warm stove, one hand still loosely holding a strip of dried meat he'd forgotten to finish. The wolf's chest rose and fell slowly, steady and unhurried, the way it always did now, the way it never had during those first cold nights in the broken cart, back when every breath came out as a visible cloud and nobody slept for very long at all. Outside, the spring wind moved gently across the ridge, the same wind that had once threatened to scatter everything Vrenna owned across the rocks, now passing by without much interest at all. Just wind. Just weather. Nothing that needed recording in a ledger anymore. At least not tonight. Vrenna set her father's book down on the small table. Beside the weatherstone that had warned them 3 days early, beside the worn sketch she'd scratched into frost what felt like a lifetime ago. 15 copper rings. A frozen ridge nobody else wanted. A little brother. A wolf with one torn ear. That was where this had started. It wasn't where it ended. Not even close. There would be more winters, more storms, more orcs from the settlement showing up with questions and leaving with answers. More seasons of Grokk growing taller and Skarn growing grayer around the muzzle. But for tonight, in a hut built from straw that everyone had laughed at, with the wind passing harmlessly outside and the people she loved breathing slow and warm beside her, Vrenna allowed herself something she hadn't really allowed herself in a very long time. She let herself rest. And that's the story of how Vrenna Ironfang, the weak blood, the beggar, the girl everyone laughed at, built something out of nothing that survived the worst winter the Bonefall territory had ever seen. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me what part hit hardest for you, and share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing everyone's laughing at right now might just be the thing that saves you later. See you in the next one.